I never imagined that a single family gathering could change everything in my life. Yet there I was, sitting on the porch of my grandmother's house in Wisconsin, a plate of potato salad forgotten on my lap, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around me. My cousin Mason, my tormentor since childhood, was standing just a few feet away with a woman I had never seen before. He introduced her as his fiancée, Maria, all smiles and bravado, as if the past years of ridicule had never existed. The sun was bright, the cornhole game in the yard full of laughter from my younger cousins, but the air around us felt heavy, charged with tension I could almost taste. Mason, always quick with a sharp comment, caught me mid-conversation with Maria and, without hesitation, launched into his usual barrage. "So, Eden finally admitted why she's still single," he said, loud enough that a few aunts and uncles turned to look. His words were familiar, yet each syllable cut like ice. I froze, my hands clenched in my lap, knuckles white. I had rehearsed how to survive moments like this for decades. Ignore him, smile politely, pretend it was all a joke. But today felt different. Maria's eyes widened as she absorbed his relentless criticism. My clothes, my car, my quiet nature, my life choices. I could see the disbelief on her face, the horror at witnessing how he treated me, his own cousin, as though my existence were nothing but entertainment for his ego. And then it happened. Maria stood, excused herself, and walked away. Mason didn't follow. He simply shrugged and returned to the men grilling by the barbecue. My stomach sank, not just from his cruelty, but from the weight of knowing that somehow this ordinary family gathering, our annual August barbecue, would spiral into something far bigger than any of us could have imagined. By the time I drove home the next morning, I had no idea that in a matter of days, my entire family would be calling, texting, yelling, blaming me for the sudden end of Mason's engagement. I hadn't said a word against him. I hadn't done anything to cause this. And yet, every call felt like a hammer pounding against my chest, each message a reminder that bloodlines and favoritism could distort reality in ways I hadn't prepared for. I am Eden, 28 years old, and this is where my story begins. A story of ridicule, betrayal, and resilience. A story of how standing quietly, refusing to justify myself for someone else's cruelty, became the act that shook the very foundation of my family. I am 28, and for as long as I can remember, family gatherings were never comfortable. My extended family lives scattered across several states, so every August, we converge on my grandmother's house in Wisconsin. It should have been a time of joy, laughter, and reconnecting, but for me, it was always a minefield. My cousin Mason is 32, the eldest among the cousins, and the one who has made it his mission to remind me, every single year, that I am somehow lesser. His parents, my mother's younger sister and her husband, raised him like he was a prince. When he was a child, he got everything he wanted: new gaming consoles, trips to Disney World, and a car at 16, while I took the bus until I was 22. I learned early on that love and attention in his family were conditional, always based on performance or charm, never on who you actually were. As kids, Mason was more annoying than cruel. He bragged about his possessions, his privileges, and the fact that the world owed him something. But as we grew older, the teasing morphed into something far meaner. He began targeting me personally: my glasses, my braces, my quiet nature. I was small for my age, shy, and often invisible in the chaos of family gatherings, an easy target for someone determined to make himself look better. By the time I was 21, I had removed my braces, learned to style my hair, and even started wearing contacts. People began noticing me differently, offering compliments I hadn't heard in years. I should have felt proud, confident, maybe even liberated, but Mason didn't stop. He simply found new ways to assert his superiority. He mocked my job as a librarian, my old Honda, the way I dressed casually on weekends. Every comment was calculated to undermine, to remind me that, in his eyes, I would never measure up. My parents tried to comfort me, telling me he was just joking and that I shouldn't let it bother me. But their reassurances felt hollow. Even other cousins would glance uncomfortably when he started his relentless commentary, yet no one ever told him to stop. Mason's parents would smile indulgently, as if his cruelty were a charming quirk, rather than the repeated verbal attacks it truly was. When I finally had a long-term relationship, Mason somehow found ways to insert himself into it, making remarks that questioned my worth or implied I would never make anyone happy. After my breakup, the comments intensified. He teased about my single status, my choices, my appearance, even at casual family lunches. And every year at the annual barbecue, it was the same ritual. Mason, his smug smile, everyone else pretending everything was fine. Through it all, I learned to keep my distance, to be quiet, and to observe. I became introspective, patient, careful with words, and careful not to give him any reason to escalate his attacks. I loved books, my small apartment, the calm of a life lived on my own terms. But Mason's shadow loomed over every family gathering, every conversation, every interaction with relatives who refused to see the harm he caused. By the time this story begins, when Maria, his fiancé, first appeared at that barbecue, I had decades of experience handling his behavior. I thought I was prepared. I thought I could endure, smile politely, and let the rest of the family navigate the tension. I had no idea that this time, everything would unravel in a way that would leave me questioning not just Mason, but the very structure of the family that had allowed his cruelty to go unchecked for so long. Even before Maria arrived, the tension at our annual August barbecue was always there, lurking beneath the laughter and clinking of utensils. Mason had perfected the art of subtle sabotage. It wasn't always a sharp insult or a loud remark. Sometimes it was the way he leaned in just a little too close, his smirk aimed at me as if I were a spectacle rather than a person. Sometimes it was a seemingly casual question about my career or my relationship status, designed to make me stumble. Other times, he'd talk loudly about his achievements, his sales numbers, his new car, his recent trip, ensuring everyone, especially me, could hear just how superior he was. Over the years, I noticed patterns. His friends and even some of our relatives would hesitate when he started, exchanging glances that betrayed discomfort, but also reluctance to confront him. His parents, particularly his mother, treated his behavior like charm. She would laugh at his jokes, shake her head indulgently, and sometimes say, "Oh, Mason, you're so funny," as though his cruelty was cute rather than cruel. I tried to ignore it, tried to smile, to laugh along, to keep the peace, but inside, a slow-burning frustration grew. Each family gathering became a rehearsal of patience. Each remark chipped away at my confidence a little more until I was constantly alert, anticipating the next jab. By the time Maria appeared at that barbecue, I had lived through this pattern for decades. I knew that Mason could turn even the simplest conversation into a stage for his superiority. But meeting Maria introduced a new variable. She was quiet, reserved, and polite, but perceptive. When we started talking alone, I could see the relief in her eyes, as if she had finally found someone who understood the discomfort of dealing with Mason. We laughed about shared experiences, favorite books, and work. I felt a tentative sense of connection, a warmth I hadn't expected to find amid the usual chaos. And that's when Mason struck. His timing was impeccable, cruelly precise. He walked up, sat across from us, and unleashed a verbal barrage that targeted my appearance, my job, my personal life, and my choices. Each comment was deliberate, loud enough for other relatives to hear, but designed to make me appear small and inadequate. Maria's reaction was instantaneous. Her eyes widened, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. I recognized that same shock I had once seen in younger cousins when Mason's cruelty first targeted them. Even in that moment, I tried to diffuse the situation. I smiled and said, "Mason has always joked like this," attempting to make light of decades of ridicule. But Maria didn't laugh. She didn't look at me like I was the problem. Instead, she stood, excused herself, and walked inside. Mason didn't follow. He returned to the men grilling by the barbecue, shrugging, as if he hadn't just pushed someone he barely knew to tears in front of the entire family. The seed of conflict was planted, not by anything I said or did, but by the collision of Mason's long-standing cruelty with someone who finally saw it clearly. The family's reaction afterward was subtle but telling. My aunt cornered me, asking, with a mixture of suspicion and accusation, what I had said to make Maria leave. My protests fell on deaf ears. Other cousins whispered, unsure how to act, some siding silently with Mason, others sympathetic but powerless. That single interaction set the stage for the storm that would follow. Mason's fiancé leaving wasn't just a personal embarrassment, it became the catalyst for a family wide confrontation where decades of favoritism, jealousy, and unchallenged cruelty would come to a head. And for the first time in my life, I realized that no amount of patience or polite silence would protect me from the fallout of someone else's choices and their perception of me. I sat there on the porch, hands clasped tightly, heart hammering, feeling the weight of what was to come. This barbecue, the same event that had been a yearly ritual, had quietly transformed into a battlefield, and I knew deep down that my life and my relationships with everyone around me would never be the same again. The moment felt suspended in time. Maria had been sitting quietly beside me, her eyes flicking between me and Mason as we chatted. For nearly 2 hours, we had shared stories about books, editors, favorite authors, and the quiet relief of enjoying conversation without judgment. I felt a strange sense of camaraderie with someone who understood the tension of being measured against someone else's relentless standards. And then Mason walked up, the predator from my childhood now a grown man, and settled himself across from us. His smile was casual, but I knew better. That smile had always signaled trouble. Before I could even say a word, he launched into his attacks. "So, Eden finally admitted why she's still single," he said, loud enough for the nearest cousins to swivel in their chairs. I froze. My hands twisted in my lap, my breath caught in my throat. I had heard these kinds of comments for years. Braces, glasses, the quiet personality, my modest Honda, my life choices. Every aspect of my existence had been fair game. But this time Maria was witnessing it firsthand. Her eyes widened, disbelief clear in her expression. She opened her mouth slightly, probably expecting me to respond, to defend myself, but I didn't. I simply sat, smiling faintly, trying to downplay decades of relentless ridicule. Mason wasn't satisfied. He continued, his voice rising with each word. "Maybe if you bought some new clothes instead of dressing like you're going to the gym, you'd have better luck." He laughed at his own joke, looking around as if inviting others to join him in mocking me. "Maybe if you wore makeup, did something with your hair, and stopped driving that old Civic, guys might actually notice you." Time slowed. My chest tightened, my stomach sank, and a cold, familiar dread spread through me. I glanced at Maria, her hand gripping the armrest, lips parted in shock. I tried to reassure her softly, whispering, "Mason's always been like this. It's fine." But she didn't nod. She didn't smile. Without a word, she stood and walked inside. The sound of her steps echoed like a warning in my head. Mason followed her with his gaze, not concern, not remorse, just a casual shrug, and then back to the barbecue, back to the men grilling and drinking as though nothing had happened. For a moment, I thought I could ignore it, that this would be just another family gathering, another instance of Mason's cruelty to endure. But that afternoon marked the beginning of something far worse. Within days, my phone rang relentlessly. My aunt's voice screamed accusations before I could even say hello. Maria had broken up with Mason. She had moved out of his apartment. And according to my aunt, it was my fault. I had manipulated her, turned her against him, sabotaged their engagement. I told her the truth. I hadn't said a single negative word about Mason. I barely discussed him at all. She hung up on me, and then the calls, texts, and messages started flooding in from the extended family. Screenshots from Mason appeared, supposedly proving my deception. I read through Maria's messages to him carefully. She wrote that watching him treat me, the cousin who had been nothing but kind, made her realize how he would treat her once he got comfortable. Mason begged her to reconsider, accused me of lying, of harboring jealousy. But Maria didn't respond. I felt my chest tighten, my heart hammering. Every rational thought collided with the overwhelming pressure of family judgment. My parents called. My mom insisted I smooth things over, that I apologize. My dad, after listening quietly, finally acknowledged the years of mistreatment I had endured and the truth of Mason's behavior. I blocked Mason, my aunt, and the relentless family group chats. For the first time, I allowed myself a moment of quiet, of control over my own life. But even in that brief calm, the reality was inescapable. This was no longer just about a barbecue, no longer just about Mason's cruelty. This was about the family choosing sides, about years of favoritism and unchecked behavior colliding with integrity, kindness, and the courage to refuse complicity. In that moment, I realized that my life would never be the same. A simple summer barbecue had ignited a family-wide storm, and I was at the center, not because I caused it, but because I refused to be complicit in tolerating abuse. The inciting incident had arrived. Maria left. Mason's engagement crumbled, and I was left to face the repercussions of a family unwilling to see the truth. I leaned back on the porch, fingers entwined, my mind racing. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And I knew that how I responded in the days and weeks to come would define not only my relationship with Mason and Maria, but the very way I would allow myself to exist within this family. The phone rang again. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail, already anticipating the fury and accusations that would pour out. Mason's text messages, my aunt's calls, the family group chats, everything felt like a tidal wave crashing against the fragile walls of my calm. I sat on my small apartment couch, hands clasped, trying to make sense of it all. A decade of enduring Mason's cruelty had taught me how to survive, how to smile through the insults, how to turn the other cheek. But nothing could have prepared me for this. This wasn't a joke, a teasing remark, or an offhand comment about my clothes or car. This was a full-scale attack on my character, my integrity, and my entire life. They were blaming me for something I didn't do, something that Maria had decided entirely on her own. I took a deep breath, trying to feel the rhythm of my own heartbeat, trying to remind myself that I was not responsible for Mason's actions or for the consequences of his behavior. But doubt crept in, whispering in the back of my mind. Did I handle it wrong? Should I have said something differently? Could I have prevented this fallout? I reread Maria's messages once again. She had explained, clearly and calmly, that she left because she finally saw who Mason really was, through the way he treated me. She hadn't spoken to anyone else. There was no manipulation, no lies, no secret plot. And yet, my family interpreted it differently. They assumed malice on my part. The injustice of it made my stomach churn. When my mother called, her voice was gentle but insistent. She wanted me to apologize to Mason, to smooth things over, to take responsibility for a situation that wasn't mine. I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I had nothing to apologize for, that I had been a target, a victim of years of bullying and favoritism. But I didn't. Instead, I explained as calmly as I could that Maria made her decision based on what she saw. I hadn't said a word against Mason. I hadn't turned her against him. I was simply living my life, quietly and respectfully. My father, on the other hand, surprised me. He listened without interruption, without judgment. His silence was a balm in the storm. Finally, he said, "I didn't realize it was that bad, Eden. I thought Mason was just teasing." His voice carried a weight of regret I hadn't expected. I told him everything, every comment, every insult, every subtle humiliation I had endured for years. He was quiet for a long moment, letting it sink in. Then he promised to speak to my mother, to help ensure she understood the depth of what had happened. I couldn't respond to the incessant texts and calls from cousins and relatives. I blocked Mason, his parents, and the family group chats. It was the first time in years that I truly exercised control over my life, refusing to be drawn into their narrative of blame. For the first time, I felt the fragile sense of empowerment that comes with standing still while the world expects you to crumble. Later that night, my sister joined me. She had gone through every message, every screenshot, every accusation. She held my hand and said quietly, "Eden, none of this is your fault. We all saw what he was doing. We all know the truth." Her words were a small anchor in the swirling storm of chaos. And yet, I couldn't escape the weight of family judgment. Even those who didn't say anything seemed to carry assumptions in their eyes. I wondered, could I ever attend a family gathering again without fear of being dragged into their narrative? Could I trust anyone to see the truth? Despite the turmoil, a tiny spark remained. I realized that Maria had acted on her own agency, that I had been honest and true to myself, and that the truth eventually would emerge. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment that defined how I would respond moving forward. No yelling, no revenge, no endless justifications. Just clarity, integrity, and the courage to stand firm in my own truth. As I leaned back, feeling the tension slowly unwind, I understood something profound. I could not control Mason, or the assumptions of my family, or the fallout of decades of favoritism and cruelty. But I could control my response, my words, my actions. I could choose to honor myself, even if everyone else refused to see it. And in that quiet, private moment, I promised myself I would not be silenced. Not by Mason, not by my aunt, not by anyone. I would face the storm with dignity, and in doing so, I would reclaim the narrative that had been stolen from me for far too long. The days that followed were a relentless storm. Every phone notification felt like a strike against my chest. Mason didn't stop. He found new ways to blame me for the breakup. He texted from different numbers, sent screenshots of his conversations with Maria, and accused me of turning her against him. Each message was laced with desperation and indignation. It wasn't just Mason. My aunt, his mother's sister, became a relentless force of judgment. She called my mother repeatedly, claiming I had ruined her son's life. She accused me of jealousy, of lying to Maria, of orchestrating the entire breakup so that Mason would be miserable. My own relatives split into camps. Some silently assumed she was right. Some whispered their support, but fear of family drama kept them quiet. My cousin Jenna finally reached out privately to tell me she was sorry that no one had spoken up sooner, that everyone had seen Mason's cruelty, but had been too intimidated by his parents' favoritism to intervene. Each phone call, each text, each voicemail felt like a tidal wave crashing against the walls of my calm. I tried to explain myself, to tell the truth. I hadn't said a word against Mason. I had merely lived my life. Maria had made her own decisions, but my words fell on deaf ears. My aunt insisted that the family should all rally around Mason, that I was the enemy, that my silence was calculated, that my restraint was proof of guilt. I remember one particularly crushing moment. I sat on my bed, phone in hand, staring at a voicemail from my aunt. Her voice was sharp, accusing, relentless. She described, in vivid detail, how I had allegedly manipulated Maria, how I had plotted to undermine Mason's engagement, and how my very presence in the family gatherings was a threat to their happiness. I felt a pang of disbelief, shock, and sorrow. How could they believe such lies when the truth was so clear? Then there were the cousins' group chats. Mason had included screenshots of text exchanges with Maria meant to prove my guilt. Messages she had sent to him explaining her own doubts and feelings were twisted into supposed evidence that I had poisoned her mind. I tried to reason with myself. They don't know the whole story. They haven't seen Maria's side. They're only seeing fragments. But the emotional weight of being blamed by nearly everyone in my extended family was suffocating. I started feeling it inside me, a mixture of frustration, anger, and an unfamiliar sense of self-preservation. For years, I had been the quiet cousin, the one who smiled politely, the one who never challenged Mason or his parents. Now I realized that my usual methods would no longer suffice. This wasn't just about enduring anymore. I had to assert myself, but carefully, because any overt confrontation could be used against me. One afternoon, I finally spoke with Maria again. She confirmed everything I had told myself. Mason's own words, his relentless need to assert superiority, had driven her decision. She had no doubts about my intentions. She trusted that I had done nothing to interfere. Hearing her validation was a balm, but it was also a call to action. I needed to stand firm, not just for myself, but for the truth. Then new evidence appeared. Mason forwarded me texts he had supposedly sent to Maria, filled with pleas, accusations, and distortions. I carefully compared them with Maria's account. It was clear that his desperation had led him to exaggerate and manipulate. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I could see clearly where he had misrepresented things. I could trace, line by line, the difference between reality and the narrative he was trying to sell to the family. The family pressure continued to escalate. My aunt called again, furious that I hadn't apologized. Other cousins chimed in, asking why I wasn't taking responsibility for breaking Mason's engagement. Even those who hadn't actively blamed me questioned why I hadn't done more to smooth things over. Every interaction reinforced a harsh truth. In their eyes, my silence and integrity were acts of defiance, and defiance had to be punished. But amid the pressure, something inside me began to shift. I realized that years of quiet resilience had prepared me for this moment. I had endured Mason's cruelty, his subtle and overt insults, and the indifference of the family. I had survived. And now, for the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was analyzing, understanding, and preparing to act. I didn't need to convince anyone else of my innocence. I needed to hold my own space, protect my truth, and maintain my dignity. I began to respond strategically. I blocked numbers, left group chats, and avoided calls that would only drain me emotionally. I kept communication open with Maria, ensuring her side of the story was understood and validated. I leaned on my sister and a few cousins who quietly supported me. Together, we began to piece together the real narrative, countering Mason's manipulations without engaging in the endless cycle of accusations. Through it all, I started noticing subtle changes within myself. The fear and anxiety that had accompanied every family gathering were replaced by clarity. I could see the patterns, the favoritism, the cruelty, and the lies. I could anticipate Mason's moves and the reactions of the family. And more importantly, I began to trust my own judgment, my own perception of truth, rather than relying on the family's skewed interpretations. The escalation reached its peak when Mason sent yet another desperate message, accusing me of stealing his fiancé and ruining his life. Normally, this would have sent me into a spiral of doubt and self-recrimination. Instead, I read it carefully, noted the manipulations, and ignored the bait. The anger, the frustration, the hurt, all of it transformed into focus. I realized that his attempts to escalate conflict no longer had power over me. I had the power to define my own narrative, to act with integrity, and to protect my life from the chaos he and my aunt were trying to impose. In the end, the escalation didn't break me. It sharpened me. It forced me to confront decades of unfair treatment, to assert my boundaries, and to recognize my own strength. I began to understand that this battle wasn't just about Mason or Maria or my aunt. It was about reclaiming my voice in a family that had long tried to silence it. And in that understanding, I found the quiet determination that would carry me through the storm to come. After weeks of relentless pressure, I found myself sitting alone in my apartment one rainy evening, the steady drumming of water against the window mirroring the pounding in my chest. The storm outside seemed to echo the storm in my life. Mason's texts, my aunt's accusations, whispers from relatives. It was all a cacophony of blame and judgment that refused to stop. I stared at my phone, now silent because I had blocked every number that had been a source of chaos. Yet the messages still haunted me in my mind. I could see them clearly. Mason pleading, accusing, threatening, spinning a narrative in which I was the villain. My aunt's voice replayed over and over in my head, scolding, condemning, insisting that I had orchestrated Maria's breakup with Mason. And the rest of the family? They seemed to be watching from the sidelines, uncertain, hesitant, or unwilling to challenge the narrative he had created. For the first time, I felt the crushing weight of isolation. I wasn't just facing Mason's anger, I was facing a family system that had consistently validated his behavior and dismissed my pain. Memories of every barbecue, every cruel comment, every laugh at my expense came rushing back. I realized, painfully, that this pattern had persisted for decades, and now, in the wake of Maria leaving, the consequences of their inaction had landed squarely on my shoulders. Tears came unbidden. I felt anger, but it was tempered by a deep, hollow sadness. Not anger at Maria, not even at Mason, though part of me ached for the injustice, but at the family structure that had enabled this to happen, that had consistently allowed cruelty to masquerade as humor, favoritism as love. I felt trapped in a narrative written by others, where truth and integrity had little value. I thought about the gatherings I had endured as a child, Mason flaunting his toys, his new shoes, his trips, the subtle derision in his parents' smiles when I stumbled over words or tried to assert myself, the pressure to laugh along, to pretend that it didn't hurt. I had survived it then by retreating, by shrinking myself, by keeping my voice soft. Now, that same family wanted me to apologize for a conflict that had nothing to do with me. They wanted me to take responsibility for someone else's recklessness and cruelty. I questioned myself endlessly. Had I made a mistake by remaining polite and measured? Could I have intervened differently? Should I have anticipated Maria's reaction? The endless cycle of self-doubt gnawed at me, threatening to erode the self-confidence I had painstakingly built over years of living under Mason's shadow. But amidst the despair, clarity began to seep in. I realized that my feelings of helplessness were tied directly to the expectation that I should conform to a family narrative that had always been skewed in Mason's favor. This realization stung. It wasn't just that I was being unfairly blamed, it was that I had been navigating an inherently unjust system my entire life. The pain of isolation, of betrayal, was compounded by decades of learned patterns in which my voice was never fully heard. In that dark moment, I allowed myself to fully feel it, the exhaustion, the frustration, the deep, aching loneliness. I cried for the years of being silenced, for the countless times my integrity had been questioned, for the way Maria's departure had been twisted into a story of my guilt. I cried for the part of me that had always hoped the family could see me for who I truly was, for the part that had believed fairness and kindness would eventually be recognized. Yet even in the depths of despair, a faint ember glimmered within me. I realized that this breaking point was not a surrender. It was a necessary threshold. To move forward, I had to fully confront the magnitude of what had happened, to acknowledge the injustice, to feel the betrayal without denying it. Only by sitting in this darkness could I prepare to act with clarity, to reclaim my voice, and to begin the slow process of turning the tide in my favor. I closed my eyes and took a long, steadying breath. The storm outside continued to pound the windows, but inside I started to sense the faintest shift. I could not control Mason's behavior, the family's judgments, or the aftermath of years of favoritism and cruelty, but I could control myself. I could choose how to respond, how to protect my integrity, how to honor my own truth. And in that decision, I began to feel for the first time in weeks a small, powerful spark of strength. This was my lowest point, the moment when despair could have swallowed me whole. Yet within it, I found the seeds of resilience, the quiet understanding that the coming choices, made from clarity rather than fear, would define not only my path forward, but also the way I would claim my voice and agency in a family that had long tried to diminish me. The low, suffocating weight of those dark days slowly began to shift when Maria reached out to me. Her message was simple, almost hesitant. She wanted to talk, to clarify, to explain. My heart tightened, part hope, part fear. After everything that had happened, after Mason's relentless accusations and the family's pressure, I wasn't sure I wanted to engage, but I also knew that hearing her perspective directly could be the clarity I needed. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop halfway between our homes. Seeing her sitting there, quiet, composed, yet visibly relieved to be in a neutral space, was strangely comforting. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel cornered or accused. We talked openly, without pretense, without judgment. She told me about her doubts leading up to the breakup, about how Mason's controlling tendencies had surfaced in private, about the way he treated her differently around others, and ultimately, about how seeing him treat me, the cousin he had tormented for years, was the final proof she needed that he wasn't the man she thought he was. Listening to Maria, I felt a weight lift. Everything Mason had claimed, the lies, the manipulations, the blame he tried to lay on me, was unraveling. Maria confirmed what I had long known in my heart. I had done nothing wrong. This wasn't about me manipulating anyone. It was about Mason's behavior being revealed in plain sight. The anger, the fear, the despair that had gripped me over the past weeks began to transform into clarity and resolve. I realized something profound. The family's accusations, the endless calls, the group chat judgments. They were not reflections of my character, but of the dynamics that had always existed. Mason had long benefited from favoritism, from unchecked indulgence, from the silence of those who witnessed but never intervened. Now, the truth was visible, undeniable. And for the first time, I felt empowered not just to defend myself, but to act in alignment with my own integrity. That evening, I carefully reviewed all the messages Maria had shared, comparing them with Mason's frantic texts and screenshots. Patterns emerged: exaggerations, distortions, and outright misrepresentations. Mason's desperation to reclaim control, to rewrite the narrative was evident in every line. The evidence was there. I just needed to trust it, to trust myself, and to let the truth guide my decisions rather than the fear of family disapproval. For the first time in this ordeal, I felt the stirrings of confidence, a quiet but potent recognition of my own agency. I wasn't powerless, I hadn't caused the breakup, and I didn't need to defend myself to those unwilling to hear. I could stand firm, protect my own narrative, and let reality speak for itself. In that moment, a plan began to form. I would maintain communication with Maria to ensure her perspective remained clear and shared with those who were willing to listen. I would engage selectively with family members, only to clarify facts, not to plead for understanding or approval. And most importantly, I would protect my peace, my integrity, and the relationships that truly mattered, those with people who respected and believed in me. The turning point wasn't just external, it was internal. I recognized my own value, my right to exist without being vilified, my right to stand tall in the face of unfairness. I acknowledged that the storm raging outside, Mason's accusations, the family's judgment, could no longer dictate my self-worth. I had survived decades of subtle cruelty and favoritism. I had endured and persisted, and now I could act with clarity, strength, and determination. By the end of that day, a profound sense of resolve had settled over me. I was no longer reacting out of fear or desperation. I was no longer shrinking, apologizing, or negotiating to placate others' misguided perceptions. I was ready to step forward, armed with truth, integrity, and the understanding that my voice mattered. The storm was not over. Mason and certain family members would continue to challenge, to accuse, to attempt to control the narrative. But I was no longer vulnerable in the same way. I had found my center, my clarity, and my courage. And with that, the path forward toward justice, resolution, and eventual peace was finally visible. The days following my meeting with Maria felt almost surreal. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without the weight of accusation pressing down on me. Yet, the storm wasn't entirely gone. Mason's frantic messages continued for a short while, each more desperate than the last, pleading, accusing, attempting to twist reality in his favor. But his efforts had lost their power. I no longer responded. I no longer engaged. The narrative was no longer mine to defend. It was his to fail at upholding. And fail he did. Within days, the cracks in his story began to appear to everyone. Maria's friends, co-workers, and even family members who had observed Mason's behavior firsthand started to share their perspectives. Stories of his controlling tendencies, his habit of belittling others, and his need to assert superiority quietly but persistently began circulating. Mason's credibility was eroding piece by piece. My family's reactions were telling. Some relatives who had initially taken sides against me now began to reconsider. They reached out cautiously, hesitant to confront Mason directly, but curious about the truth. My cousin Jenna, my steadfast ally through the ordeal, sent messages expressing relief that the facts were finally visible. She encouraged other family members to see things clearly, highlighting Mason's own patterns and behaviors that had long gone unchecked. Mason's parents, predictably, continued to defend him initially. Their favoritism and indulgence were ingrained habits, difficult to abandon even in the face of clear evidence. But as more accounts emerged from Maria, from neutral relatives, from friends who had observed his behavior, they began to realize that the facade they had maintained was crumbling. My aunt, relentless and vocal, attempted to maintain her narrative, posting accusations on social media, blaming me for stealing Mason's happiness. But her attempts only backfired. Public perception shifted subtly but decisively. Relatives blocked, unfollowed, or called out her behavior. The same platforms she had used to amplify her complaints became mirrors reflecting the truth. Through it all, I remained calm. I didn't respond to the provocations. I didn't post clarifications on social media or engage in public arguments. Instead, I focused on myself, on my life, and on maintaining the relationships that truly mattered. I continued to meet with Maria, strengthening our friendship, and began to develop a relationship with Gabriel, Maria's brother, who had been supportive and kind from the start. When I finally re-engaged with the extended family, it was on my terms. Mason and his parents were noticeably absent from family gatherings. The annual barbecue, the same event that had once been a crucible of humiliation, was now a space where I could breathe. I arrived with Gabriel, with Maria accompanying us, and for the first time in years, the gathering felt peaceful, even joyful. Relatives greeted us warmly. My grandmother hugged Gabriel and expressed gratitude for his kindness toward me. My other cousins, once hesitant, now engaged openly in conversation, laughter ringing through the yard without tension. Mason's absence was telling. The very family members who had once excused or ignored his behavior now had to face the consequences of it. Invitations were declined, messages unanswered, social media posts ignored. His credibility had faltered, his manipulations visible to those who had once been blind. It was a quiet but undeniable collapse of influence, a slow but certain recognition that his actions and his patterns were no longer tolerated or admired. I, on the other hand, felt a profound sense of liberation. I had not sought revenge. I had not acted out of anger or spite. I had simply stood firm in my truth, maintained integrity, and trusted reality to reflect the facts. The fallout was not orchestrated by me. It was the natural consequence of Mason's choices and the family's long-standing enablers finally witnessing reality. Even the social media storm initiated by my aunt and Mason faded over time. My mother and father, now fully aware of the truth and my experience, offered support without intrusion. My sister remained a steadfast ally, ensuring that I never felt alone in navigating these difficult dynamics. And Maria, whose friendship had been instrumental in validating my perspective, remained close, a living reminder of the power of integrity, honesty, and observation. By the time I attended the next major family gathering, the narrative had shifted. Mason was absent. My aunt's influence had waned. My presence, calm and assertive, commanded respect rather than inviting ridicule. I was no longer the quiet cousin, the target of jokes and belittlement. I was Eden, someone who had endured, who had acted with integrity, and who had emerged stronger for it. The fallout was complete. Mason and his family experienced the social consequences of their choices, the very behaviors they had long excused and perpetuated. And I, having maintained my dignity and honesty, could finally step into family spaces without fear, without tension, and without the weight of unjust blame. It was a quiet victory, subtle yet profound. No one celebrated it publicly. No one needed to. The truth had revealed itself, and the consequences had unfolded naturally. I could finally move forward, free to build relationships, to embrace life's joys, and to create space for myself and those who truly valued integrity and kindness. Months had passed since the storm of accusations, the relentless messages, and the family drama that had threatened to consume me. The quiet victories, the subtle shifts in perception, and the friendships that had proven steadfast became my anchors. I realized that survival alone was not enough. I needed to reclaim joy, connection, and self-respect. Gabriel and I planned our wedding carefully, surrounded by those who had supported and believed in us. Maria stood by my side as a friend, a confidant, and even became part of our chosen circle of family for the day. My parents attended proudly, fully understanding the struggles I had endured. For the first time, a family gathering didn't carry tension or fear. It carried laughter, warmth, and the sense that I could belong without compromising my dignity. I reflected on everything I had experienced: Mason's relentless cruelty, the years of favoritism, the family's initial unwillingness to see the truth. But most importantly, I reflected on my own strength. I had maintained integrity, acted with patience, and refused to allow manipulation or blame to define me. I had set boundaries, protected my peace, and trusted the truth to emerge in its own time. The lesson was clear. Standing firm in your values, even in the face of relentless pressure, is not an act of defiance. It is an act of self-respect. You cannot control how others perceive you, or the narratives they construct, but you can control your response, your boundaries, and your integrity. Sometimes the most powerful action is simply to remain true to yourself, allowing the consequences of others' choices to reveal the truth naturally. I no longer worried about Mason or those who had doubted me. Life had moved forward, rich with friendship, love, and the satisfaction of being seen for who I truly am. I had reclaimed my narrative, my voice, and my space in the family. And in doing so, I had discovered something far greater than victory over others. I had discovered the enduring strength and resilience within myself. As I looked forward to the future, weddings, gatherings, and the life Gabriel and I were building together, I understood that boundaries, integrity, and self-respect were not just lessons for surviving family drama. They were lessons for life, and now I could finally embrace them fully, without apology, without compromise, and with a quiet, unshakable confidence.